So, good day everyone. Good day, ma'am. I am Merpin Omilda PACULANAN from Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, Section 1GC7, and this is my partner.
Good day everyone, my name is Alfonso L. TORRALBA from Bachelor of Science of Civil Engineering, Section 1GC7. And the topic of my report is all about revolts against the tribute.
My topic in this report is about the taxes imposed by the Spanish government in the Philippines and the tax reform of 1884. So, let's start. So, for today's topic is about taxation during the Spanish period. So, before that, I'm gonna discuss some brief history about taxation in the Philippines where it started. So, it's all started from the Asian Filipinos where they pay their taxes to their datu or the chiefs of the protection they gave to them. The tax was termed buwis. Everyone is required to pay their taxes except for the dato or the chieftain's household. Punishment for not paying taxes was also implemented in this period, where the arrival or the invasion of the Spanish people from 1521 to 1898 gave the Filipinos a modern concept of taxation wherein 16 years old to 60 years old were forced to pay tributes or tributo to the King of the Spain through the colonial government worth 8 reales or 1 peso per year, but there are also other forms of payment like gold, chickens, textile rice, and forced labor or polo e servicio, which we will discuss later. So the word real or real, meaning royal, plural reals, was a unit of currency in Spain for several centuries. After the mid-14th century, it underwent several changes in value relative to other units throughout its lifetime until it was replaced by the peseta in 1868. So, a peso worth before is much bigger than what it's worth now. So in 1 peso you can pay your tax in a year, but today your 1 peso can only buy a piece of candy. With that, it really shows that as time passes by, things really change. There is a quote says that the only constant in this world is change. Taxes imposed by the Spanish government in the Philippines, which taxes during the Spanish period was compulsory. All the Spanish colonies in America and the Philippines were required to pay taxes for two reasons. First, as a recognition of the Spain's sovereignty over the colonies. Second is to defray the expenses of pacification, which the act of forcibly suppressing hostility within the colonies, and the governance thereafter. So with that, firstly, what is taxation and what is tax? So taxation is the act or process of the system of taxing people or things, and tax is the actual amount or service mandated by the authority to all people. During the Spanish period, the taxes in the Philippines were categorized into 5, which are the tributo, sanctorum, donativo, caja de comunidad, and servicio personal. The first category was the tributo. It was a general tax paid by a Filipino to Spain, which amounted to 8 reales. Those who were required to pay the tribute were the 18 to 15 years old males, the town workers such as those in the road constructions, and those who's in public in nature, which are the carpenters, bricklayers, blacksmiths, tailors, and shoemakers. And next is the sanctorum. It was a tax in the amount of 3 reales. These are required for the cost of Christianization, including the construction of churches and the purchase of the materials for religious celebrations. So, sanctorum is the tax being paid as a support to the church. So, the third one is the donativo. It was introduced in 1635 and it was a tax specifically used for the conquest of Mindanao. It was a tax in the amount of half real for the military campaign of the government against the Muslims. In years later, however, the amount collected from donativo was almost exclusively used for the Spanish Fort Zamboanga. This collection was used to crush the Moro raids. And next is the Caja de Comunidad. It was a tax collected in the amount of 1 real for the incurred expenses of the town in the construction of roads, repair of bridges, or the improvements of the public buildings. And the last one is the Servicio Personal, or also called Polo e Servicios, was a form of a forced labor during the Spanish period in the Philippines. All able-bodied males from 16 to 60 years old were required to work for public works, just like construction of bridges, churches, and galleon ships. They were called polistas. Earlier, the polistas were required to work for 40 days. So, however, the number of days was lowered to 15 days in year 1884 as a result of the tax reform issued through a royal decree. Some of the polistas were brought to fight against the Muslims and others were brought in the Spanish expeditions. And the only way that a polista can be freed from the forced labor was when he paid a falya or a fine, which is equivalent to 1.5 reals. But only very few could afford to pay the fine. And there are other people who are in the higher rank that are exempted, just like the gobernador silio, which are the one who have small salaries but were exempted from paying tax. And the other one is the cabeza de barangay, or the head of the barangay, which is responsible for the peace and order of every barrio. And other members of the principalia were exempt from forced labor and also a falya.
During the Spanish colonial period in the Philippines, in 1521 to 1898, there were several revolts against the Spanish colonial government by indigenous Moro, Lumad, Indians, Chinese, and Insulares, Filipinos of full or near full Spanish descent, often with the goal of reestablishing the rights and powers that had traditionally belonged to Lumad Timoys, Maginoo Raja, and Moros Datus. Some revolts stemmed from the land problems, and this was largely the cause of the insurrections that transpired in the agricultural provinces of Batangas, Bulacan, Cavite, and Laguna. Natives also rebelled over unjust taxation and forced labor. There are four revolts against the tribute. First, the Cagayan and Dengras revolts, 1589. Second, Agustin Sumuroy's revolts, 1649 to 1650. Third, Francisco Maniago's revolts, 1660 to 1661. And the last, Andres Malong revolt, 1660-1661. The Cagayan and Dingras revolts against the tribute occurred in Luzon, in the present-day provinces of Cagayan and Ilocos Norte. In 1589, Ilocanos, Ibanags, and other Filipinos revolted against alleged abuses by the tax collectors, including the collection of high taxes. And there were 6 tax collectors were killed by the rebels. And because of the incident, Governor General Santiago de Vera sent Spanish and Filipino colonial troops to pacify the rebels. But in the end, the rebels were pardoned. Because of this revolt, the Philippine tax system was reformed. They were the first native revolts that stops the tax corruption. Agustin Sumuroy Revolt, better known as Juan Sumuroy, was a Filipino hero and waray leader of the Sumuroy Rebellion, a rebellion of native Filipinos against colonial Spanish forces that occurred in eastern Visayas in 1649 to 1650. Juan Sumuroy, a brilliant military leader who led the people of Samar in opposing the conscription of men from their homes to work in the shipyards of Cavite. He won several victories against the Spaniards and their allies, but he resisted for a year, and he was captured and been executed. During the height of the insurrection, Don Juan Ponce went hiding in Cebu and stayed with Father Ignacio Alcena, a Jesuit and historian. Sumuroy did not make peace with the Spaniards. He was killed by his own men, and his head, separated from his body, was presented to Don Henes de Rojas by one of his men. On the day of his execution, his 7 key lieutenants were also executed. The Maniago Revolt was an uprising in Pampanga during the 1660s. It was a revolt against the Spanish during the colonial period and was named after its leader, Francisco Maniago. During that time, Pampanga drew most of the attention from the religious group because of its relative wealth. Francisco Maniago is a leader of the village in Mexico, Pampanga, who led the revolt in protest against forced labor and confiscation of rice by the Spaniards. He blocked the mouth of the rivers of Pampanga to stop commerce with Manila. His rebellion ended with the acceptance of his demands by the Spaniards. Because of this, they set their campsite on fire and the fight ensued. This was the start of the bloodier revolt in Pangasinan. The Malong Revolt. Andres Malong was the Maestro de Campo of Binalutungan, now San Carlos City in Pangasinan in the 1660s. He assisted many Spaniards of governing different towns in Pangasinan, and as such had learned and was trained to use force and cruelty. Andres Malong, who led some natives in Pangasinan to take up arms against the Spanish government and proclaim himself King of Pangasinan. However, his kingdom was short-lived and soon most of his forces abandoned him, enabling the Spanish forces to capture him and subsequently executed. Later, Juan de la Cruz Palares, a native of Binalutungan, led a renewal of the revolt. The Spanish authorities reviewed the demands of the natives and required the alcalde-mayor of Pangasinan to resign. The people of Pangasinan continued their resistance nonetheless, but they finally defeated in March 1764.
So the next topic is about the tax reform of 1884. One of the good reforms which Spain introduced in the 19th century was the tax reform of 1884, as provided by the Royal Decree of March 6, 1884. This tax reform contained two important provisions. The first one is the abolition of the hated tribute and its replacement of the cedula tax. And the second one is the reduction of the 40-day annual forced labor to 15 days. In 1884, the payment of tribute was repealed or abolished and replaced by a graded poll tax. This tax was collected by means of a certificate of identification known as cedula personal, which every resident was required to obtain. The cedula had to be carried at all times, shown in court, and carried along while traveling. If someone is not able to present their cedula to a guardia civil, they will be imprisoned for being indocumentado, which means that they lack valid document or legal personal identification necessary to prove their identity. The cedulas personales were first issued based on the Royal Decree on March 6, 1884. All men and women, residents of the islands, Spaniards, foreigners, and natives who were over 18 years old were required to obtain a cedula. The only exemptions were the Chinese, who paid another poll tax, the remontados de Enfeles, that were not subject to the local administration, and the natives and colonies of the archipelago of Hulu and of the islands of Balabac and Palawan. So all in all, there were 16 different classes of cedulas. Originally, there were 9 classes tax. The rate of taxes ranged from 1.50 pesos to 25 pesos and a tenth, gratis, for priests, soldiers, and for privileged classes. In summary, Asian Filipinos started the practice of paying taxes. The purpose of paying taxes was simple. It was for the protection they received from the datu. The collected tax was called buwis. Everyone in the community is required to pay their taxes except for the chief household. Non-payment of taxes, which was already punishable during this period. This is the power of the state to impose and collect revenue of the public purpose to promote the welfare of the people of the particular society. The arrival of the Spaniards ushered in the modern concept of taxation. The native Filipinos, each between 16 years old to 60 years old, were forced to pay tribute to the King of the Spain through the colonial government worth 8 reales or 1 peso per year. Other forms of payment came in gold, chickens, textile, copper, rice, and forced labor or polo e servicio, but finally abolished in 1884 and was replaced with a personal cedula certificate identifying the taxpayer. During the Spanish period, they have introduced the Philippines with 5 different taxes, and those taxes has specific purpose on what they will collect. The 5 taxes are the tributo, sanctorum, donativo, caja de comunidad, and servicio personal o polo e servicio. Why is tax specifically critical for any money provided by taxation has been used by states and their functional equivalents throughout history to carry out many functions. Some of these include expenditures on the war of enforcement of law and public order protection, or the building of churches, or the property economic infrastructure, public works, social engineering subsidies, and operation of government itself. But due to the tax collectors' unjust system, by corrupting the workers in paying their taxes, it started a revolt against them.
So there were 4 revolts by the natives. The first revolt was the Cagayan and Linguas revolt. This revolt was against the tribute. This revolt was triggered by the abuse of the high collectors collecting high taxes from the natives. But this revolt was easily stopped by the government. But many revolts had rose up in the subsequent years. The other 3 revolts are the Agustin Somoris revolt, Francisco Maniago's revolt, and the Andres Malong revolt. The Agustin Somoris revolt happened when the mayors sent the warais to the shipyards for forced labor. Rebels had started to rise and caused the death of a parish priest. They then formed a government. They planned to capture and execute Agustin Somory, but this led them to their defeat. David Dula, a co-conspirator of Somory, continued the quest, but later then was captured and was executed. The Francisco revolt rose because they were made to work under unfair conditions, and they were against the tribute, forced labor, and rice exploitation. The Andres Malong revolt started to revolt against the abuses of the Spaniards because they were experiencing the same abuses with the other natives that started the previous revolts. Malong called for Maniago to join forces to lead the people of Pangasinan against the Spaniards and succeeded. The only good reform that the Spaniards introduced was the tax reform. These contain provisions which are the abolition of the hated tribute and its replacement of cedula task, and reduction of the 40 days annual forced labor for 15 days. The cedula personalis is then issued based on the royal decree, which women, men, Spaniards, foreigners, and natives who are 18 years old already are required to acquire a cedula. The only exception to this is the Chinese, remontados de infieles that were not subject under the local administration, and the natives and colonists on the archipelago of Jolo and for the islands of Balabac and Palawan.
For my critique on the topic of this taxation during the Spanish period in the Philippines, during the Spanish period, there are some biases, and of those biases are biases in taxation. The biases during the Spanish period is the ones who have less education and have less economic opportunities. The Spaniards also strengthened the skin color hierarchy by creating a division between Filipinos and Filipinos with Spanish bloodlines. The skin color hierarchy instituted a form of a structural violence. The structural violence is a way in which the structure of a society socially disadvantages a group of people by stereotyping or stigmatizing them. Much darker-skinned Filipinos were stigmatized as a low-valued citizens. Now, the biases in the taxes during this period are the unjust system by high collecting of taxes. Spanish authorities didn't show any sign of fairness to the Filipino people, especially in the division of responsibilities in polo e servicio, or also called forced labor. In addition to mistreatment, the natives suffered with harsh labor from the Spaniards. As a result, the population went down drastically. Between the natives who are struggling to procreate and dying to the harsh conditions. Because of this irresponsibility, Filipinos are still working apart from their allotted times of work. Filipino who were working for galleon trade also experienced misfortunes because of the heavy loads that the Spaniards were asking for them. This resulted for workers to die and families separated because of poverty. The Spanish period policies and taxation was virtually designed not only to keep Philippines under control but also to exploit her rich natural resources. The onerous system of taxation, the arbitrary and unjust forced labor, and unequal treatment consequently brought about a disordered and unbalanced economy.